Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter in the book of Job, and we're going to do what we normally do in the first chapter of any book whenever there is no antecedent narrative context to establish. We follow the formula of the who, what, when, where, why, just to lay the foundation and the groundwork for the preamble. Now, the who wrote the book of Job was an anonymous Hebrew who lived centuries after Job. There are events described in the first two chapters, the first of which we're going to cover today, that only the reader and the author are privy to. And Job is the namesake of the book. He is the human protagonist. Many books in the Old Testament do have a human protagonist, but the Bible is the story of God from start to finish, and there is always a divine protagonist. And in the Old Testament, that protagonist is God the Father. In the Gospels, it is God the Son. And in Acts through Revelation, it is God the Spirit, but he is spoken of as Yahweh in written form, but in the poet, from the mouth of the human characters, the nomenclature of preference is El Shaddai. These are not Hebrew people. The only reference to Yahweh in any of the poetic dialogues is in 12:9, but in the prologue, which is the first two chapters, and in the epilogue, the 42nd chapters, we do read the covenant name of Yahweh, and Job would have been an Edomite, as were his friends. There are other people and characters in the book, some of whom are named, some of whom are not. He has an unnamed wife, 10 children. The 3 daughters that he has as replacement are named in the end, and there's also misleadingly named comforters who struggle to make sense. We're not going to meet any of them until the second chapter, but for the record, they are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, Zophar, the Naamanite, and then Elihu, who we meet in the 32nd through the 37th verse. But also mentioned in the first chapter is Satan, and Satan is behind the teaching not only that there is no heaven and that there is no God, but also that there is no hell and that there is no devil. He is the author of deception, and he is able to accomplish his designs and purposes more thoroughly. He does have many committed, active, devoted disciples and worshipers, but the main minions that he uses are people who are unaware of his existence and his activities. We're going to learn of some of his tactics and devices in the first chapter, and part of wisdom consists in knowing that there is a devil. So curiously absent from all the monologues, the theological discourses, which are the struggle to make sense of Job's situation, is the omission of the name Satan. So we know things that the people perhaps didn't know. We know this will make more sense. But it is wisdom literature. Now, wisdom is found and is imparted all throughout the Bible, but it has a category and a genre whose specific focal point of concentration is wisdom. There are 3 of them in the Old Testament: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The first 2 were written by Solomon. We don't know who wrote Job, but it is wisdom. And if the tone, or if the message of the law and the prophets is to obey and believe respectively, then the message of wisdom is to think, ponder, and consider. These are more, especially Job and Ecclesiastes, are far more ask-oriented than answer-oriented, and because it is less comforting because there are no easy answers to the questions that are asked, but part of wisdom is embracing this, and it really, Job and Ecclesiastes really shatters the wisdom, the exact science of the conventional wisdom of rewards for righteousness and punishment for sins. Solomon does this as an observer rather than a victim of life's anomaly. So Solomon has a somewhat similar approach to the world from the top of the world, whereas Job, what happens to him, we read in this first chapter, there's literally nothing like it, no parallel in pain and experience. And the fact of pain and suffering are central to wisdom. We'll develop this thought more fully when we make it to the why in our formula. We're on the when. Now, this is a pre-Pentateuchal writing. Job is the earliest chronologically written, but the laws of Moses were not written by Moses himself. They were compiled in written form. The Hebrews in the ancient world had oral tradition, so the actual writing and preserved record would not take place until the reign of Solomon, but even before that, the book of Job was written. Obviously, Job didn't take place before the creation. He flourished during the patriarchal era. He may have been a descendant of Esau, because we learned that he's a native of Uz, a town which corresponds with what became Edomite territory. But we do know that he lived outside and before the covenant nation. So this takes us to the where he is outside the Uz is located to the east of the Jordan River and outside what became the Promised Land, and it's also before Israel became a nation. So there was Canaanite inhabitants, and the question is that more specifically that the categorization, the taxonomy of Job belongs in the not only in wisdom literature, but more specifically the genre of theodicy, which explores and explains the relationship of suffering to the righteous. Why do bad things happen to good people? There are no easy answers. And what happens to Job is there's literally nothing like it. His experiences without he was an innocent and upright man who was visited with calamity in the twinkle of an eye, the degree and severity of which is truly mind-boggling. So why did it happen? And there are no easy answers for why do good things happen to bad people. Sometimes sinful people provoke innocent people, and it's not according to any retributory reward for past sins done. But in Job's situation, his was supernaturally sent, but it was not God as he alleged, but Satan, and we meet him. So first verse, first chapter, book of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and straight, and one who feared Elohim and turned aside from evil. There was a man named Job. His historicity is attested to by Ezekiel and James. So Job is fact, not fiction, and Uz was a real place. It corresponds to Edomite territory, and Job's name translates as hated, which is interesting enough because in the first chapter he is beloved, then he feels hated by God, but he is ultimately blessed beyond measure, twofold of what he had. But his name certainly, in the Bible, names mean something. They indicate more. They're not arbitrarily selected, but they are sent with a message in them. And he was perfect. He was not sinless. He denies any such claim in his discourses, but he was perfect in the sense that he was blameless. He was upright. He had his integrity. Straight is another way to translate upright. So the two things, the devil takes his children, he takes his family, and he takes his wealth in the first chapter, but he does not take his integrity or his innocence. So he not only was, but he had and remained. There's a definite article. And the fear of Elohim and the turning aside from evil are recognized in the 28th verse of the 28th chapter. The 28th chapter is a poetic interval by the author of Job, not spoken by Job, because it has no reference to his situation or experience, but in that he formulaically presents wisdom as fearing Elohim. This is the assumption of wisdom literature, not only wisdom books, Proverbs 1:7 and 9:10, but also Psalm 111 and 10 and Ecclesiastes 12:13, but also turning away from evil. So part of wisdom consists in resisting and overcoming temptation, not succumbing to evil. Evil is the easy way out, but the wise will avoid it like the plague and avoid its consequences and calamities. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. In the Hebrew numerology, both 7 and 3 are significant. 7 is the number of perfection, completion, totalness. Its origins lay to the 7 days of creation. So ever since, to have 7 sons, to have a progeny and children was a means of immortality, because the doctrine of the afterlife is not crystal clear at this stage of the development of Old Testament religion. But 3 daughters, 3 is also significant. God exists as 3 in 1, and that number, the numbers 3, 4, 7, and 12 proliferate and abound throughout Scripture. So they always point to something and mean something. And his possessions were 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 female donkeys and a very large body of servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. So the numbers 7 and 3 appear once more, the 7,000 sheep and also the 3,000 camels. This parallels the number of sons and daughters, 7,000, 3,000, 7 and 3. But more than that, wealth, this was a pre-monetary society. Money would not be invented until the Lydians around the year 600, coin and currencies, I think around the year, a little before the year 600 BM, before Messiah. So the number of possessions would have been a sign of wealth, and all these things would have been valuable commodities. And not only did he have all these animals to work his farms and produce the things for him, but he also employed a very large body of servants. Servants were a symbol of wealth and status and prestige, and Job had a lot of them, so much so that he was the greatest of all the people in the East. That means he was the richest, he was the most respected, he was also the most righteous and the most wise. But one of the things of wisdom literature that is especially revealed in the book of Job is that there is no perfect consensus of wisdom amongst wise men. This is made plain by the contradictory conclusions between Job and his comforters. And his sons went and had a feast in the house of each on his day, and sent and invited their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. This was a regular routine. They were children of privilege. They had wealth, they had resources, they had their own homes, and they had a father who loved them and was circumspect to a sacrifice in the off chance that any of them sin. But that number 3 daughters appears once more. And it came to be, when the days of feasting had gone round, that Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings, the number of them all. For Job said, "It might be that my sons have sinned and cursed Elohim in their hearts." This Job always did. Job was a fastidious and circumspect man. He did sacrifices just in case. Now remember, he is outside and before the covenant nation. There was no institutional priesthood, so Job served as his family priest, which would have been the practice in the ancient world. But he did this bright and early, first thing in the morning, and he would offer the sacrifices. He had plenty of animals to sacrifice from, but he always had one just in case his children said something, or in their hearts, cursed them in their hearts if they had a wicked thought or unclean thought, just in case they did that. That's what he made the provision to say that, vicariously to sacrifice for them, because Job would never curse Elohim in his heart, and Satan's challenge is to get Job to curse him to his face, and this Job passed the test at the conclusion of the chapter, as we read. And the day came to be that the sons of Elohim came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan also came among them. The sons of Elohim are the angels. These are the created beings that are not human, but they are superior spiritually and human. And Satan is an angel. Before Satan was Satan, he was known as Lucifer, and he was outstanding amongst the angels, both in wisdom and beauty, until his great wisdom and beauty he succumbed to the sin of pride and launched his rebellions, and has been irreversibly wicked ever since. Nevertheless, we do learn that he has heavenly access, and the name Satan translates literally as the adversary or the accuser, and we read of his tactics and devices. He is the tempter and he is the accuser. We'll explain that, because the dialogue that ensues. Now, there are dialogues throughout the book of Job, the heavenly one and then the ones on earth, chapters 3 through 37. Then Yahweh breaks in 38 through 41. And Yahweh said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And Satan answered Yahweh and said, "From diligently searching in the earth, and from walking up and down it." The question that Yahweh asked is answered by Satan. Satan is the god of this earth. He is the domain. He is the god of this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4, and he is not lazy in his ministry. He is working diligently. He works overtime to bring as many people to hell as he is able, because misery enjoys company, as the old adage goes, and he knows he's doomed, so he wants to bring as many people down, and he doesn't have to search very far in the earth you don't have to look very far to see evidence of his work everywhere. There is a real devil, and the existence of evil is testament and evidence to his work. And he is not lazy. He is motivated. He is sincere. He is determined. He does possess several admirable qualities, even though they are employed in destructive designs and purposes. Satan is someone who demands to be taken seriously. He is strong. He is crafty. He is cunning, but he is an already defeated foe. Nevertheless, just because his eternal fate is certain doesn't mean that yours is. So he may defeat you, and you may join him in the defeated ranks and not make it to heaven. And Yahweh said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a perfect and straight man, one who fears Elohim and turns aside from evil? Much of what we read in verse 8, we read in verse 1, but in any case, Yahweh points with pride to Satan. Satan doesn't have to go far. You can find an evil person. There is none good, no, not one on the earth. Psalm 14:1 and 53:1. But there is one that Yahweh can point to with pride to. He wants to know if he has seen his servant Job, and that is how he describes Job, as his servant. And Job did serve. When he calls him the same thing in the 42nd chapter 4 times in 2 verses, and he did serve his purposes by undergoing the test, the temptation that Satan offers in response to Yahweh pointing with pride to him. There's literally no one. He is unique. He is special. There is none like him on the earth. He is perfect. He is straight. He fears me, and he shuns and eschews evil. He resists temptation, and he has a degree of mastery over sin, and he is my servant who I take pride, delight, and joy in. And Satan answered Yahweh and said, is Job fearing Elohim for naught? Here comes the temptation and the accuser. These are two of his devices. These are two of his strategies. He tempts. So if you are tempted to do wrong, that's the devil tempting. God does not tempt anyone. Nevertheless, he does permit Satan to tempt him. But first, Satan tempts God in order to tempt Job. But also, he is the accuser. He's saying that this will make more sense when we read the subsequent verse. Have you not made a hedge around him, and all around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. So Job is rich, and he didn't do anything wrong. He did not fleece the orphan or the widow to gain his with. He worked hard. He was an honest business transactor, and he had been rewarded because he had been righteous. So there is some science to the covenantal law. Now, much of this, what he's ultimately saying to God is he is accusing Job of worshiping him for naught. He's saying that Job is selfish. He's only doing this because you have blessed him. And he is accusing God of being unworthy of worship. You have to pay people to worship you. The only reason Job loves you so much and does all these things that you praise him for is because he is rich, and you have allowed him to become rich. Take this away, and he will curse you to your face. You read in the next verse. But stretch out your hand, please, and strike all that he has, if he would not curse you to his face. So we read the accusation and then the temptation. He's tempting him to tempt Job to blaspheme him to his face, that he would not bless him with his mouth, but he would go straight to his face if you took all this away from him. He knows that it belongs to you, and he gave it to him. But if you take this all away from him, then he will have no use for you. He will not delight in you. He will not rejoice in you. He will not worship you. He will not give you the due deference that he is doing, because you have this hedge of protection around him. Take that all away, and he will curse you to your face. And Yahweh says, bring it on. And Yahweh said to Satan, see, all that he has is in your hands. Only do not lay a hand on himself. And Satan went out to the presence of Yahweh. Now, to tempt God is a very serious thing, but we cannot tempt him to sin, because he is literally incapable of sinful. So it was not sinful for God to indulge Satan's temptation. He knew that Job would pass the test. He does not. Satan is a providentially bound creature. He is at his behest. He cannot operate outside the parameters or behest of Elohim. He is a providentially controlled creature, so he is limited in what he can do. Nevertheless, he has a green light to take You just can't hurt him, but you can take all these things. And the lesson that we learn in Satan's strategies here is that if you give the devil an inch, he will take a mile. So he said that he did everything he could without striking his hand against him, as we read. And then he proceeds from the presence of Yahweh to do what he has been permitted to do. And the day came when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their brother, the firstborn, the eldest brother, the eldest of the 7 sons and the 10 children. He would have been the heir, and he had his own home, and they were feasting and drinking wine. Nothing. They weren't, hedonistic alcoholics or anything. There was nothing sinful. They were doing wholesome festivities, but something calamitous happens to them in spite of them having done nothing wrong to provoke it. And the messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding alongside them, when Sheba fell on them and took them away, and they smote the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to inform you. The oxen, we read that he had 500 yoke of oxen in the 3rd verse, and that all came away from Sabaeans. These were nomadic raiders. During the writing of Job, they would eventually settle and be civilized in the modern country, what corresponds to the modern country of Yemen at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. This is where the queen who visited Solomon, the other author of Old Testament wisdom literature, she traveled some 1,000 miles, but they would have been nomads. They would have been closer to Edom in these days, or Utz, or wherever it was. But these bandits came, these raiders came, these Bedouin nomaders came. That's what they did. They often stole, and they not only, to add insult to injury, or rather injury to insult, they killed the servants in addition to stealing all his donkeys and his oxen. While he was still speaking, another one came and said, the fire of Elohim fell from the heavens and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to inform you. Something supernatural is clearly at play here, to have fires to rain from the heaven, to have lightning simultaneously strike all the sheep dead and all the servants dead. All at once means that there is some work beyond our reckoning, a powerful work that is clearly aligned and against Job. And it's not God, it's Satan. Satan is the one. Much of suffering is demonic induced, but God does allow suffering for reasons beyond that wisdom can answer. There are no easy answers to the questions of why do good things happen to bad people, but to criticize God as unjust is the equivalent of reading a novel and criticizing the author for not resolving the plot midway through. All things will work out in the end. While he was still speaking, and another one came to said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them away and smote the servant with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to inform you. So just like that, 1, 2, 3, these things just keep coming, and it's all in the twinkle of an eye. He's losing everything. The camels, the sheep, and first the oxen and the donkeys. So these are all listed in the 3rd verse and how many he had them, and now he is reduced to nothing. Not only that, but he had a very large body of servants, and only 3 of them seem to be left alive. These are the ones who are not killed. These all have a witness. They all miraculously somehow survive to tell him that he is losing all these things and all his servants. Now the identities are the Chaldeans. These were originally a nomadic people. They eventually would settle into a settled civilized people that would emerge as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the one that captured and conquered Judah in 586. But before that, they were nomads and bandits. But they took Job's camels and they killed his servants, except one who escaped to tell him. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their brother, the firstborn. This is something we already learned, but with the way things are going, you think it possibly can't get worse. It does, in fact. Animals, there's no affection for them save their monetary value. At least a lot of farm animals, people do love their dogs, and shepherd mentality will lay their lives down for the sheep, but for your own children to die, that is eventually what we read what happens. And this all happens in rapid fire succession, 1, 2, 3, 4, just like that. Job was a prosperous man. He was righteous. He was rewarded for his righteousness. He had done nothing wrong. He was at peace. He was at security. He lost it all in the twinkle of an eye, but it does get worse in the second chapter. So it in fact can get worse. So no matter what you're going through, there is always someone who is going through something worse, but Job could not say that. And see, a great wind came from the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house and fell on the young men, and they are all dead. And I alone have escaped to inform you. So all the men, the death of the women is not mentioned, but they were certainly in the physical structure which collapsed over them. This wind came from the wilderness, the desert, the east, and it came at such a velocity and an intensity that the entire physical structure of the house collapsed under its velocity and intensity, and all those who were in it would have been crushed by the crumbling structure, except miraculously this one who must have been outside at the time but lived to witness, but then saw the 10 dead bodies, or knew that they were in there and that there was no way they could have survived. He probably would have searched through the rubble and called their names out, but to no avail. Then Job rose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell to the ground and did obeisance. This is his reaction. The first thing he does is rises up. He may have been seated when this was told, but something like that is, all that at once. Then he tears his robe. This is his sign of mourning and grief, to tear your clothes. That is something what you do when you are in anger, when you are anguish. You tear your robes. And shaving your head, this is an act of humility. This is the act of a desperate man who is so humbled that, he does not feel worthy to have his hair. And falling to the ground face down and did obeisance. Obeisance has pious entailments and connotations. So he responds in worship. And that is his instinctive response with all this calamity. So he is everything he is described. He is perfect and straight. He does fear God, and he expresses it. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I return there. Yahweh has given, and Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of Yahweh. Naked we come from our mother's womb. We cannot take anything, so all the wealth we can acquire. Look at all the wealth that Job had. Even if he wasn't restored twofold at the end, he couldn't have taken that all with him to heaven. We are as naked when we enter death as we are when we exit our mother's womb. And Yahweh is the source of blessings. He is also the source of cursings. He is sovereign. Everything we have belongs to him to begin with, and everything he takes away is his to take away to begin with. We have no real claim for ownership. We are at best stewards. And Job was certainly an excellent steward. He always had a helping hand for those who were poor. Nevertheless, now that everything was taken away, the nature of his complaint in the 30th chapter is that when he was on top of the world, he always lent a helping hand to those who were in need. Now that he was in need, there was no one to lend a hand but to bless rather than curse Yahweh. It's easy to say God gives and God takes away. When he gives to us, we're just acknowledging his sovereignty when we are the beneficiaries of it. And there's nothing wrong with being blessed, but how many of us can acknowledge his right to take away when we lose everything, unprovoked, unmerited, in the twinkle of an eye? In all this, Job did not sin or ascribe wickedness unto Elohim. He passed the test, but Satan does not go away. He passed the initial test, and it does get worse, believe it or not, but Yahweh was correct in trusting Job to honor his name and not curse him to his face, because he didn't do what Satan said he would do. But Satan accelerates the intensity of his temptations. He took his family and he took his wealth, and the only thing left is his health. Now, many wealthy people would exchange inordinate amounts of money just to be healthy again. So to lose that on top of losing everything else, that takes us to the second chapter. The second chapter, he passes the test again, And just the parallel to 121 in that is when his wife says, curse him and die. And he does agree to the latter. He wishes death in the 3rd chapter, but he does not curse Yahweh. And he does pass the test, but he does wish death. He is in tremendous amount of anguish as a result of and as because of what has happened. So much of the subsequent text is, after the 2nd chapter, is just the dialogues, their struggle to make sense of seemingly suffering, senseless suffering. And there are no easy answers to this question, but we are indebted to the wisdom of the book of Job for revealing such a question with such intensity and such insight as there is no parallel in literature. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.